Welcome, everyone, to the Kidlit Distancing Social. I'm Laura Backus, publisher of Children's Book Insider, the Children's Writing Monthly, and co-creator of writeforkids.org and writingblueprints.com. Welcome. We're glad you're here with us today. If you are brand new to us or watching us for the first time on recording, and you want to get on our list to hear about all of our great guests coming up on the Kidlit Distancing Social, you could go to writeforkids.org/ultimate cheat sheet and get on our list, and you'll get a free ebook, The Ultimate Children's Writing Cheat Sheet. We are celebrating our 30th year in business this year, and this compiles all of our best info on getting started writing for children, and it's free. So you can sign up and get that, and then you'll hear about all the other fun stuff we do. And if you are interested in subscribing to Children's Book Insider, we have a special deal for our socialites. It's $5 a month, and you get the newsletter delivered to your inbox once a month. It's about 20 pages a month, no advertising, and it has articles on the craft of writing, on business aspects of writing, motivation, all sorts of areas of being a writer, as well as interviews with authors and editors and agents. And we have a special submission opportunity every month. We have market listings every month, but we have a special one every month where either an editor or an agent gives us a special above the slush pile code that our subscribers can use to submit directly to them and jump over the slush pile. So that's part of your subscription, along with access to the membership site, the CBI Clubhouse, which has 30 years of all sorts of great information. So writeforkids.org/CBI gets you that. Okay, this is what we do every week. We celebrate the successes of you. So I have some great ones this week. Pamela Mones writes that she self-published her picture book, Lavender Bear Goes to the Circus, illustrated by D. Vicky in March of 2020. So congratulations, Pamela. That is an adorable cover. Melva Gifford's story Forfeit was published in the January 2021 issue this month of Cricket Magazine. Congrats, Melva. Cricket is a very prestigious publishing credit, so good for you. And Alda P. Dobbs' debut middle grade novel Barefoot Dreams of Petra Luna, inspired by the experiences of her great-grandmother during the Mexican Revolution, will be published by Source Books in fall of 2021. So congrats, Alda, and we are looking forward to seeing that. I was on your website and I was checking out all the backstory about that book, and it's fascinating. So congratulations to all of you. I want to hear your good news. Email me, mail@writeforkids.org, and put celebrate in the subject line, and we will feature you on a future Kidlit Distancing Social. And as I say every week, it does not have to be a book publication or a magazine publication. It can be that you found a critique group, or that you finished your draft, or you cleaned and organized your office, as we were chatting about earlier before I started recording. Any of that is cause for celebration, and we want to celebrate with you. So send me your celebrations and we'll feature you on a future social. And I have something to celebrate. The Nonfiction Fest 2021, which starts in February, is a free 30-day extravaganza of inspirational posts and activities, one a day from February 1st to March 3rd, all revolving around writing nonfiction for kids, all written by authors, illustrators, and industry professionals, including moi. I will have a post on there, and you can also register for prizes. So if you want to write nonfiction, this is an awesome thing to take part in. Again, it's free, but you have to register in order to have access for it by January 31st. So that's NF Fest for Nonfiction Fest www.christebbetts.com. And then starting February 1st, you'll have access to those great inspirational and instructional posts and activities to get you going writing your nonfiction for children. Okay. So now I get to welcome my awesome guest. So Chris Tebbetts is a co-author with James Patterson of the New York Times best-selling humorous middle school series with 7 titles. And I love the titles of these books. You can see a few of them on your screen there. Middle School, The Worst Years of My Life. Middle School, How I Survived Bullies, Broccoli, and Snake Hill. Get Me Out of Here. They're just so over the top melodramatic, which is so perfect for middle school. I love it. He's also, as well as the single title with James Patterson, Public School Superhero, which is awesome. I want to talk about that tonight. And he's a co-author with Jeff Probst of the middle school adventure series Stranded and Stranded Shadow Island, with 6 titles there. And the young adult novels Me, Myself, and Him, and M or F, ? And 4 volumes in the Viking fantasy middle grade series. So we have a lot to talk about tonight. And as you can see right there on your screen, he will be co-teaching a Highlights Foundation workshop called Craft Community in Your Career, a support group for experienced storytellers that runs from February to June this year. And you can find out more by going to the link on the slide. I created a bit.ly link, so it's bit.ly/Craft Community Career. If you forget that, just go to the Highlights Foundation website and click on events and you'll be able to find it. It's highlightsfoundation.org. So, Chris, come on camera with me and we'll chat. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you. And thank you for your patience tonight.
No problem. It looks like you got it worked out.
Semi-technical difficulties, which, was to be expected because 2020 apparently has not quite left the building yet. So,
No, it's December 50th or whatever it might be.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, exactly. But I'm glad you're here, and we're going to talk middle grade, which I love. So,
Laura, I just have to tell you, back in, I don't know, when I was just getting started, 2002, 2001, I was a subscriber to CBI, and your columns were some of the very first, you were the first person I became aware of in this industry as a sort of a regular contributor to my knowledge of the business.
That's awesome.
It's super fun to be here 20 years later talking to you.
Wow. Yes, it is. That's so great to hear. And, like I said, we are celebrating our 30th year in business. So it's really fun. I've had several guests since I've been doing these socials who have said the same thing. They're successful now. They've published a gazillion books, and they'll go, 20 years ago, I subscribed to CBI. So that's really, really fun to hear. And it also makes me feel really old, but at least we're all growing up together. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, great. So, my other computer just did a weird thing. Okay. Yeah. So your middle school series, let's start with that, is written in first person, and it's super funny. And, I want to talk about sort of, first of all, creating middle school age protagonists, I think is a super challenge. And I give you a lot of credit for taking that on, because I feel like that's the age group. If you don't get it absolutely right, you are totally screwed. Like your readers are going to know immediately that you're faking it, and they're going to put the book down. But then to do it in first person, so you have to get the voice dead on, not just in the dialogue, but in the narration, and to be funny on top of it. So how do you do that? What is your secret? Do you spend a lot of time with kids this age, or do you just remember what it's like to be 12?
I think I cycled through a lot of different kinds of writing when I was sort of trying to figure out what my format was going to be. And I think it's probably no coincidence. It was interesting when I finally realized that when I really settled on middle grade as my primary heart work. I love doing lots of different things, but middle grade's been the bulk of my career. That corresponds to the time in my life when I was the biggest reader I've ever been. So there's something about writing for that 8 to 12-year-old Chris, for myself, I think, that helps me key in. There's something really vivid about my memories of that time of life. I always say I have, my emotional bat phone goes back to fourth and fifth grade. For other
Right.
people, it might be high school or whatever it might be. I
Hmm.
think that helps me key in. I was also fascinated when I first started working on this middle school series, since it had been a long time since I was in sixth grade. I went to my local school and I did some like mini focus groups with the kids to talk about, what does it mean to be a sixth grader today? And whereas I learned a lot about the props, the technology, the things in school, I was stunned at the degree to which I heard my own emotional and developmental experience told back to me by those kids. I to the degree that these things, howsoever things change, they also remain the same.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
then in terms of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Oh, I was going to say, I remember that when my son, who is now 25, but when he was going through elementary school, I volunteered in his classroom, and every year the same thing. It took me back because the kids were the same. By the time he got to fifth grade, he's like, "Okay, mom, you're done. You can't come in my class anymore." So I didn't see middle school, but I know exactly what you're talking about. It does, and it takes you right back to that moment in your own life. Yeah.
Yeah. And would also say, I try to be a stickler for voice. It's a little difficult to say, I get it right, because for some people I will and some I won't. But I think a lot of people may not realize the degree to which it really boils down to working in the micro, at the sentence level, at the word level, and also making choices between grammatically correct language versus language that might be more natural to a kid. Rafe Kachadorian in the middle school series will never say "it seemed as though." He's always going to say "it seemed like," as if, even though that's not grammatically correct. And again, you have to dance a dance there, because to some degrees that you want this to be aspirational. You want kids to, to read up, but you also want to be true to the character.
Yeah, yeah. That phrasing is so important to think about, and also, you know, kids are going to speak to their peers with different phrasing than they would to their parents or to a teacher or to the principal of the school. And I think when writers are working on dialogue and also first person narration, you have to remember that it's the context of the conversation is just as important as far as the rhythm and the fragments of speech and the words that the characters use. So there's so many different elements to think about there
Yeah,
when you're creating that.
I've always seen a lot of parallels between writing and acting in terms of getting inside a character's head, figuring out what motivates them. And a lot of this, I think we're going to talk about this in a different way soon, but a lot of it for me is about, yes, what the character would say, but also what the character wouldn't say. In first person narration, over describing a setting, for instance, can start to ring false. And really getting inside the character's head. What would they notice first? What would they not notice in that room that I'm not going to comment on? And that sort of thing. And an element of this is also trusting the reader to fill in some of those details and to see beyond the details that you offer to the other things that they might imagine or that you imply.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, when I used to edit manuscripts, one of the first person narration sort of faux pas people always made is the character would describe their own appearance, you know, as they were staring in the mirror brushing their hair usually. And I'd say, how often do you describe your own appearance to, when you're talking to yourself or to someone? Only if something's wrong with it, but you wouldn't sit there and talk about the color of your hair. It's just not what we do. So all of those things you have to think about if you're writing in first person, for sure. So your public school superhero also has that first person narration and a lot of humor in it. And both of these the middle grades books and series that you wrote incorporate very realistic sort of middle school situations. We've got bullies, we've got, that wanting to be popular or feeling embarrassed, and all of those things that every kid kind of goes through. How do you incorporate these elements into your plot in a way that doesn't, you're not condescending to the reader, or you're not going, oh, it's going to be okay, you're going to get through this, but you actually allow your characters to feel it and get through it in whatever way they are going to get through it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have a lot of answers here. One of the things I think about is the proportional amount of space that kids' problems take up in their lives. I love stories there's and movies and TV as well. I think of Netflix's Stranger Things, which was for adults and for kids of a certain age. And I think of that as a great example of taking the kids' problems seriously and treating them as such. They were big to the kids, so they're big to the story and trying to reflect that. There was something else. I took a bunch of notes based on the questions you sent me. It took me a while that this wasn't somehow intuitive for me, but I now work as hard as possible to make my characters as smart as possible. I never want them, one of my sort of guiding principles is I never want somebody to look up from the book and go, I don't buy it, or I wouldn't. I mean, some kids are going to go, I wouldn't do that. You can't please every reader. But if there's something that seems obvious to me as a prospective reader, I'm going to make it obvious to my character as well. There are a lot of things in stories you think you might need to eke out or let them figure out for themselves, but sometimes moments of direct knowing are really useful for story and for making your character more compelling to a young reader.
That's interesting, moments of direct knowing, but it has to be something that we believe that they would know.
That's right.
That's
right. But there are times when you can skip past the mystery because the character figures it out on their own, or they figure it out more quickly than you might imagine.
Right. Yeah.
And as the reader's surrogate in the story, it says, I trust you, reader, to be as smart as the character as well.
I like it. Well, and I think if you make your characters smart, then you can also make them dumb in other ways that get them into trouble, but then they're a balanced character. So you can still give them the flaws that they need to have conflict and drama in the story, but they're not just total losers. You've got these smart, they're smart in other ways. Yeah, balanced out.
One of the tensions of middle grade fiction is exactly that. Like we depend on our characters to make big mistakes. And we have to depend on ourselves to make those as organic as possible to the story, either by establishing a flaw early on so that it tracks for the reader, or organic to the plot, some sort of unforeseen circumstance that demands a mistake that the reader will buy.
Okay, great. So make big mistakes. I think that's really important. A lot of beginning writers are afraid to get their characters in too much trouble. And I think there is this feeling among some sort of aspiring authors that the characters must be role models for the reader. And if they do stupid things, if they get in trouble, then the reader's going to think, oh, I can do that too. And it's like, well, no, but if you show them the result of getting in trouble or the result of their mistakes, that's the lesson. Do you ever worry about making your characters do something that a parent or a teacher might say, I can't let my kid read this book?
I don't worry about it too much. That's the kind of thing that can be too stifling at the computer. The example that comes to mind in the first middle school book, our character Rafe pulls the fire alarm. That's a very serious thing to do. And we did get some pushback on it. But people who were able to read the story in context and read it through to the end, where you start to understand where some of these choices are coming from for the character, even something as extreme as that, I felt comfortable that we weren't saying, hey, this is a fun thing to do.
And again, it's trusting your readers too, to know that this is a book. This is not real, if kids grow up with picture books where you have talking animals and all sorts of fantasy stuff going on, they know there is the pretend world out here in the book, and then there's the real world. Yeah.
And for that matter, role models should be seen as making mistakes as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's how they overcome their mistakes that makes them role models. Yeah. Let's see. So Public School Superhero has a comic strip running through it. And actually we were chatting in the chat box before this started. One of our listeners here is working on a middle grade novel with strong graphic elements. And even the middle school series has a lot of sort of illustrations and graphic elements. Do you think that that's sort of just going to be the norm these days, moving forward with middle grade fiction, where we do have more visual elements in the story?
I'll be curious where it goes proportionally to the constellation of available books. we sort of have three categories, very roughly speaking, and somebody might speak more knowledgeably than I would on this. But, I think of novels, I think of books like the ones I do with Jim, which are heavily illustrated, Diary of a Wimpy Kid and others, Dork Diaries, and then graphic novels, which have also exploded.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I think about in this conversation is something that Linda Sue Park once said at a conference, which is at some point we had a first generation of readers who were coming to story through visuals and not through text, through screens and not through text. And it's an incumbent on us to be responsive to that, not to the elimination of straight novels, because I think there will always be readers for those, of course.
Sure.
But to be responsive to a generation who's visually oriented. I'm very visually oriented. I wasn't a reluctant reader, but I was a gigantic television watcher as a kid, and that has creative implications for me as an adult.
Sure.
And it's also just a lot of fun.
Yeah. And like my son Matt is very visually oriented. He's actually an artist, and he was an avid comic strip reader very early on. So to have some of those visual elements worked into middle grade fiction, as with your public school superhero, just feels natural to kids who have grown up with the comic books or the graphic novels. So how do you convey that to an editor, or was this part of the whole concept that was thought out before you even started writing the book, that there would be sort of the comic strip element along with the novel?
The way I work with Jim Patterson, I've done a lot of co-authoring, and he is who he is. So
Yeah.
He calls the shots. I always say I work for Jim, whereas I worked with Jeff on Stranded and with Lisa on my YA novel. So I knew from him that this was to be a heavily illustrated novel, and he asked me to put illustration notes right into the text. Because those are going to go through him to the illustrator. So he wants to know what we have in mind, and he might want to adjust those himself. So yeah, I do anything from like a quick note to a couple paragraphs or a whole page if it's like a 2-page complicated spread of an illustration. And as somebody who was a film major in college and loves to think about my stories like movies, like a lot of writers do, I love that element of this. I know that's a little bit unusual, for say picture book writers who are not always invited to put illustration notes in the manuscript, but we're very specific as we pass that on. And even then, the real treat is when the book comes out and you see what artists really like, why artists are artists and what they really do. Like as many details as I put on the page, they still reimagine it in a way that inhabits the story a little bit more, that brings something new to the page. It's a really fun collaboration.
That's great. Let's talk about, I have more questions about, your writing, obviously, but since you brought up working with other authors, being a co-author, let's talk a little bit about that. Now you're co-author with James Patterson and also with Jeff Probst. So these are, and I think, am I saying his name right? Probst?
Yeah.
Okay. Who's the host of Survivor, and it's not a show I watch a whole lot, so that's why I wasn't sure how to pronounce his name. But anyway, big names, high profile. How'd you get that gig, and what's it like working as a co-author with people like this?
It's been a really strange series of coincidences. It almost seems like I must have gone looking to become a professional co-author, because I worked with Jim and worked with Jeff and then worked with Lisa, who all, by the way, have last names that start with P. So all of my co-authored work is shelved under P. Convenient. Papa Dimitriou, Probst, and Patterson. So yeah, each one is a little bit different. With Jim, I work from his, you asked me how I got into it. Is that right?
Sure. Yes. We'll start there.
My first series was for a book packager, the Viking, which you had in that first slide. When Jim decided to move from adult books into children's books, he went to them and said, "Do you have any prospective interested writers for this?" They approached me, said, "Do you want to write some sample chapters?" Yes, I did. And it went from there. And the middle school series was born. Wow. That's the short version. And then, as a result of just showing up for the business and meeting people and having done this project, and this editor moved there, Jeff Probst approached Puffin Books a little bit later and said, "I'm looking for a co-author." And one of my editors from that Viking series, and that was now at Puffin. This is how it works, just showing up and showing up and showing up. And I wrote some sample chapters there. And on top of all of this, I would say, I do a whole talk about this. And one of the things I talk about there is, the existence of a collaborative personality, which I would say I have. former filmmaker, former theater artists. Those are all collaborative
Right.
storytelling. And I also, honestly, I don't feel as though, relative to some writers I know, I feel like I have a pretty low ego. I'm really interested in writing story. I don't have a huge attachment. I feel more, as much craftsman as artist in that regard.
Yeah.
And with the high profile co-authors, that also means I get to stay home and they can go promote the work, which is a huge treat.
That is very nice.
Yeah.
That is very nice. So, do they come up with the basic concept or outline, and then you write it, or
Yeah.
how is that generally how it works?
Jim comes up with I have to say, a lot of people think that Jim is, sort of rubber stamping books with his co-authors. And I am here to tell you that is not the case. He comes up with concepts. He comes up with, I'll get a 25 to 40 page detailed outline of a 40,000 word book from him, chapter by chapter. And then I start writing it in pieces about over the course of about 6 months. And we'll talk once a month about how the manuscript is coming along, changes that might want to happen. So I am working from his situations and characters, but he's also, he's smart enough that he knows he can't micromanage. So it creates a lot of he just says, if something in the outline is not working, go ahead and fix it. And if we still don't like it, we'll fix it again. So that's where the collaboration comes in. With Jeff, we spent a lot more time going back and forth. Who are our characters? What's our plot going to be like? He knew storytelling, but he had never done books before. So I had a different rule.
Yeah. Now that Survivor series is interesting, or sorry, Stranded series. You've got 4 protagonists basically, and it's in third person, but you are telling the story from all of their viewpoints throughout the book, which is tricky. How do you do that? How do you keep the reader centered on whose story they're following at that any given moment?
A couple of things there. My rule, and I don't think I've ever broken it, and I would suggest people not breaking it, is no POV shifts, no point of view shifts in the middle of a section or chapter. Start a new section when you switch to another character. Otherwise, it can become very confusing. And particularly for middle grade, in the first sentence, maybe 2, I put some strong indication about who we were with at that point. And then also a lot of people do, we did chapter headings with the characters' names. I think those are of limited value. As a reader, I breeze right past those myself. So you do have to be really clear in the text. And then even within that, to capture sort of the essence within third person limited writing for 4 different characters, you still want to go in as deep as possible. I use a handout at my workshops on something that Michelle Massaro calls deep POV, is about capturing a character's perspective by eliminating things like she felt. And instead of saying she felt scared, you say it was scary, or her goosebumps covered her arms, or something less cliche than that. But really getting inside the character's experience, even through third person narration.
And is it important when you're sort of handing off from one character to the next and you're switching, in third person, but switching the viewpoint character, that it makes sense within the action of that chapter that you would hand off from one character to the next? Do you understand what I'm asking here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Stranded, I had different rules for section breaks than I did for chapter breaks. For section breaks, my rule with myself is we never go back in time, like not even a second. It has to always be moving forward. And then there might be a time break before the next chapter. That allows you to narratively take a breath. But within the chapters, within those shifts, I tried to keep it moving as quickly or as smoothly as possible and seamlessly as possible.
Great. And I just want to remind people who are listening, if you have any questions for Chris, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to those in a few minutes. So I have one more middle grade question before we move on to YA here. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about what we were going to talk about, that you write with a very spare, propulsive quality, you described it, for your middle grade, and that especially appeals to reluctant readers. So can you explain that, exactly what that means?
Yeah, and speaking of reluctant readers, just back a few topics, all those visuals, not every graphic novel is for every reader, not every illustrated novel is for every reader, but there is something about giving a kid sort of a fighting chance on, if they're not used to getting all the way through a book and filling it with visuals, making it a little easier, that sense of accomplishment, that's another big valuable piece about those heavily illustrated books, I would say.
Right.
And I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I am going to refer to my notes because I have some very specific toolbox items for people to think about here.
Good.
Let's see. A spare propulsive quality. This was something that I also just happened to have in common with Jim Patterson when we met. I think that's what makes us creatively simpatico. But I have learned a lot from him. I really encourage people to think long and hard, if you're writing in this style, about not what belongs on the page, but what doesn't belong on the page. What can you do without? And the amount of stuff that he has encouraged me to get rid of that I resisted and then went, oh, you're right, it's better, over and over again. It's been a huge learning curve in that regard. But in terms of keeping the reading, like clipping along, appealing to reluctant readers, creating page turners, I think I have 5 points here. Look for redundancies, which can be very subtle. My examples here are, Burton was asleep on the bed. His eyes his closed eyes twitching lightly and his arms wrapped around a pillow. Do you need to tell your reader that a sleeping character has closed eyes, for instance? And this is what I'm talking about, getting down into the sentence and word level. This is where the grace is in the details, and where a lot of people can sometimes, it's hard for writers to get themselves across the finish line because they don't want to do that 12th, 15th, 20th draft that's going to really polish. What happened next changed everything is a perfectly good sentence. Do you need it? Or are you about to just tell us what happened next anyway? Those are kinds of things to look out for. This is from an article called From As Simple as Possible on the Highlights blog. You can Google As Simple as Possible Highlights Tebbetts if you want. I avoid too much off-camera time. I give myself one bit of description, internal monologue, narration, flashback, reflection, anything that's not moving my story ahead. I'll give myself 1, maybe 2 paragraphs per chapter or section. And that doesn't mean I won't have a few, phrases or, half a sentence that might describe something. But in terms of stopping the narrative, be really strict with yourself about limiting that in each section.
Right.
Make sure your scenes begin and end at the right moments. That's one of the things I see most frequently in student manuscripts, where they do a lot of setup that they don't need, or a lot of wind down that they don't need. And even with some manuscripts, when I've seen whole novels, it's not at all uncommon to come back to a student and say, your story starts in chapter 3.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Exactly.
Watch chronology, things like, my eyes flew open as soon as the alarm clock went off. No, the alarm clock went off and then your eyes opened.
Then your eyes flew open, yeah.
Readers might, it's the kind of thing readers may or may not notice, but again, cumulatively, this stuff really adds up.
And in your subconscious, it's bugging you as a reader. You're like,
yeah, right?
Something's just not quite right. Yeah, even if you don't realize what it is. Yeah.
And then the last point is, I think of sentences like dominoes. So the end of one needs to match to the beginning of the other, with lots of exceptions. But again, if you were to say, when the alarm clock went off, my eyes flew open, talk about your eyes, talk about what you see next, because you just mentioned eyes. Don't talk about the clock. If you want to talk about the clock next, end the sentence with the clock, for instance. And again, it's a subtle thing, but it really does add up.
Those are great tips. And those are the kinds of things you're looking at. Then once you've got your story down, the big picture stuff, are these things you go through then on your polishing stage and really start tweaking the individual words and sentences like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the hard thing for any writer really is to, if you know that those are important things, to not worry about them when you're getting your first draft down.
Which is so hard.
It's so hard because they'll just stop you. You'll end up polishing a sentence 20 times instead of writing the chapter first.
Yeah.
So you can go back and polish it. Yeah. How long did it take you to be able to, or is it still a struggle for you to put that fine tuning stuff on the back burner while you're creating your first draft?
It's still a struggle for me. This is one of those pieces of advice that I am good at giving and not following. For instance, write your whole first draft and then, go back and start fixing. But I know, again, I don't mean to overemphasize Linda Sue Park, but she edits. And if you ever get a chance to hear her talking about editing, anybody out there, she has a brilliant mind for this stuff. And I do what she does, which is I write some, I go back and I read, and then I write farther into the book. And then I go back and read the next day and I write farther into the book, sort of a leapfrog type thing. But even then, yeah, it's a very heavy temptation to try and fix too much too soon.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, it's wasted effort because you may end up starting your book on chapter 3 and chapters 1 and 2 are, and if you polished those,
That's right.
they're nice, but no one's ever going to see them. They're not going to be in your book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I like Stephen King's thing, which is you write the first draft for yourself and you write the subsequent drafts for your audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we talk a lot on our editing programs that we have on writing blueprints, story, scene, sentence. So you're kind of going from big picture edit, then to scene by scene, and then finally on the sentence level after that.
Yeah.
So, okay. Let's talk YA real quick here, and then I want to get to some questions. But you've got your 2 YA novels. Also have some humorous threads in them, but YA is a different beast from middle grade. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how you shift as an author when you've got, your character's worldview might be a little bit different. The humor is a little different because the situations they're in might be different. What is that shift you have to make for YA over middle grade?
This one is a bit of a tough question for me. And I think my best answer is about proportion as opposed to quality of humor, which is to say in my middle grade books, it's going to be a little more situational or more often situational, more often physical, or a physical imagination, a physicalization of the character's imagination, like with Rafe, who has that Walter Mitty, fantasy life in these books. And with YA, it's going to be a little more internal, maybe a little more about wordplay, about self-reflection, but not what that doesn't mean, my YAs never have pratfalls or what have you. But just proportionally, I think that's generally true. Humor is so subjective as well. It's tricky.
Right. And I think I was talking to another writer about this a while back, and she said for her, the difference was middle grade characters react and then think, whereas YA characters think and then react. Now, they might not react appropriately, but they take a beat, whereas middle grade, it's all reaction. And then they step back and go, oh, wait, I shouldn't have done that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And I don't know if you found the same thing with your books, or it might just depend on the stories you're writing, but I thought that was kind of an interesting take on the difference there.
It correlates to my sense of middle grade, huge generalization again, of middle grade being about characters who are sort of looking out at the world in a whole new way, and YA characters who are looking in a whole new way.
Exactly. And I think that's really sort of the shift there. And then the humor, like you said, is I think much more situational, and you said sort of almost has a physical quality to it with the middle grade. Again, that's kind of looking out. YA, it's and in a lot of YA, the humor comes from the way a character thinks about what's happening around them.
That's right.
So sort of their inner voice might be funny.
Yeah.
Or there's humor in sort of the banter between two characters and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take some questions here. So Rajani asks, can you tell us more about point of view choice in middle grade? I tend to write in the third person, but I'm seeing more books of the kind I want to write, like adventure stories, in the first person. Does it depend on the story you're telling or the character, or how do you choose what viewpoint is most appropriate?
Yeah, in the abstract, no wrong answers. I've always been a proponent of this idea that there are no bad ideas, just bad execution. And that doesn't mean that I haven't switched POV along the way, sometimes as an exercise, which can be really illuminating, and sometimes as a full rethinking of a book. I do think that middle grade, I think that's Rajani's right, that we used to see a higher proportion of third person narration in middle grade. We're getting more and more first person. I think more and more middle grade readers are dealing with more and more difficult and internal issues. I think that's maybe not a coincidence. But I wouldn't sweat it beyond one's own gut feeling about what this thing needs. And I also wouldn't be afraid to try different things. Again, even as an exercise, just sometimes if I know I'm going to stick with third person, but I'm having a hard time capturing the character's experience, I'll just write the scene in first person to inform myself and then go back to what I was doing, for instance.
Right, right. Do you, when you're developing your character's voice, especially for first person, do you do a lot of character development exercises for yourself? Do you have your character write you a letter? Do you interview your character? All those things authors talk about?
I mean, I'm nodding. How I'm in flux. I used to do that a whole lot more. I'm doing what people see. I'm more, increasingly these days. I'm discovering the character on the page as I write. But I like a lot of those exercises. The one you mentioned is actually a real favorite. Write a letter to yourself from your character and have your character tell you what you're getting right and wrong about them. It can be a great, light bulb kind of thing. I also recommend writing. I like to write my character's perfect day, not because their lives are perfect, but because it helps me identify what might motivate them. What do they love? That sort of thing.
That's great. That's great. And again, a lot of this information probably will never be in your book, but you might come up with a little nugget of something talking about their perfect day that sparks a plot twist or some detail of your
That's
character.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we always are going to have to know more than our readers will ever know.
Yes. Great. Susan asks, what are the pros and cons when you co-author a book? Well, you talked about some pros, and don't feel you have to tell us cons if you don't want to. But
I mean, when I talk about this subject, one of the pro con things I talk about is creative compromise, and there is definitely creative compromise. And there can, on the one hand, that can involve some necessary egolessness. On the other hand, that egolessness becomes more easier if I can really dedicate what I know in my head to my heart and my gut, which is the story is king. If it serves the story, it doesn't matter whose idea it was. And that sort of leads to the pro there, which is creative synthesis, and the fact that in some ways these stories never would be what they are without the putting together of two minds. I like that collaboration, but it can be challenging. I've heard a lot of people talk about how they've tried co-writing and it just doesn't work for them. In which case, I say don't do it. But I've had lots of great experiences with it myself.
That's great. And like you said, they do the marketing.
Right.
You get to just do the fun writing part.
And even, I mean, the one YA I did where Lisa Papadimitriou and I were both sort of at the same phase in our careers, I at least had a partner for marketing, which was also nice.
Absolutely. Terry S. Says, differentiating voices with different narrators is difficult. Could you repeat your advice about how you kind of had your four narrators sound different from each other?
I actually had some notes on that, so let me go back to those. And this writer who I don't know, Michelle Massaro, has, if you want to Google it, her handout on deep POV has been invaluable to me. So my advice on multiple point of views: don't shift in the middle of a chapter. Use chapter and section headings for what they're worth. And then deep POV includes things like getting rid of pronoun verb pairings about your point of view character. So instead of saying she saw, he saw her coming through the door, say she came through the door. Don't describe the situation, convey thought and emotion using realistic internal dialogue. So instead of she was so embarrassed, it might read, talk about embarrassing. That was the third time she gotten his name wrong, that kind of thing. And tip number 3 on that handout, don't label emotions. Instead of he felt nauseated, his stomach clenched and a hot wave of nausea brought a prickle of sweat over his upper lip. Getting inside the character's experience.
And then when you have essentially four protagonists, and you're moving from one to the next within a chapter, each protagonist has to have a very, their own personality, their own things that they care about when you're following them. Do you do the full-on character development for yourself with each of your four protagonists?
That I absolutely do. What does the character want? How do they go about getting it? What gets in the way? And then it's also, it's kind of fun, and it can also be really informative. I'll suggest come up with some corollaries for your characters. If you had 4 characters, what animals might they be? What would their, what is their driving emotion through the story? Use those as your guideposts, put it on the bulletin board. And if you're stuck for, how to differentiate Jane from Vanessa, if Jane is a bird, then, maybe she's not eating much, or, whatever it might be. Don't be afraid to use people, say, I don't want to use people I know as a basis for a character. Use everything you have at your disposal.
Absolutely.
And use those guideposts, commit to them. Commitment is huge. It means letting go of a lot of other choices, which can feel like you're losing something. But by committing fully to making your characters, driven by these animal ideas or whatever choices you decide to make, that commitment is more powerful than trying to accommodate too much.
Mm-hmm. So when you have 4 protagonists, does each have to serve a purpose in the plot? Is there a reason for each person to be in the story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I thought about that so consciously on Stranded, but I did know that each character had to have their own arc, which is to say they had to have an emotional climax of their very own. They had to have highs and lows of their very own. I tracked that for myself. I made a grid. What is Jane's hypothesis? What is Carter's? What is, so that I knew that I wasn't forgetting anybody.
Mm-hmm. And did it, this might have just naturally happened, but did you think I need at least one character who's going to always take the group in the wrong direction so that there's tension, and another character who's smart enough to get them out of trouble when they need it? Or did you even worry about that and just kind of let it develop on its own?
I worried about that in a way, but without making myself too beholden to my preconceived notions, so that I could continue to let them, let somebody else lead this one time, even if they don't do it well or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. It sounds like it's a juggling act. You've got all these balls in the air, and you've got to make sure that none of them drop before they're supposed to.
You're creating 4 character arcs. You're creating an arc for each book, an arc for the series. It's I love the puzzle of it all, but it's a gigantic puzzle.
Yeah, sure is. Sure is. Let's see. Do you have any favorite resources for writing middle grade or YA, like Save the Cat? So, any great books on writing that you love?
I don't know specific to middle grade, but a couple of things that people might not have heard of. There's a book called Write Your Novel from the Middle, which was revelatory for me. It's a slim little volume. It's really worth it. It talks about the character. You open so many books to the very middle, and your character is having what this author calls a mirror moment, where they have to decide who they are going to be relative to their challenge in the story. So it's just another way of thinking about. I'm a big believer in play and improv as part of the creative process, not just for fun, but as a practical matter. And Stephen Nachmanovich has a dense but fabulous book called Free Play that I recommend to anybody who will listen to me recommend it. Musician, it's not even written for authors, but it's one of the most revelatory creative books I've ever read.
Great, great. We had a question in the chat box about, Susan says, the name of the person you mentioned who writes about point of view, Marissa, what was the last name?
It was Michelle Massaro, Massaro.
Michelle Massaro, okay. Massaro, okay. And then Writing Your Story from the Middle was the book that you just mentioned. Okay, great. Let's see here.
Write Your Novel from the Middle.
Write Your Novel from the Middle, yeah. So we've had a couple questions on adding humor. Is this, do you go into the, especially for middle grade, saying, I'm going to write a funny book, or do you create characters who just get themselves into funny situations?
I am in what I would guess is the minority of writers, which is I'm a little more plot oriented, whereas most of the people I know are a little more character oriented. So yeah, I go in going, I'm going to write a funny book. The thing I did not see coming early on in this process for me was the humor is almost always the last thing to layer in. I get the situations. It's not until I've really digested the story that I can then start to make it funny. And in some regard, that may be about, as I'm experiencing with the character, some of the difficulties and challenges, and it's only with perspective that we can see get a sense of humor about those things. That might be why it takes me so long. The challenge is not writing jokes, but writing humor that's, organic and germane to the story.
Mm-hmm. I imagine too, if you go in saying this is going to be funny without first experiencing the story like you talked about, you may end up being unnecessarily mean to your characters or making fun of them in a way that is not the way you intended to. If humor is sort of the first layer, like you said, that you put in.
Yeah, I have a bad habit of trying to make my characters well balanced, and sometimes I just make them unlikable in the process. That can be a little bit difficult. But a character with a sense of humor, I mean, for me, nothing adventure as well, but humor, like unlike anything else, really keeps kids turning pages. It's like, where's the candy on the next page?
Mm-hmm.
And one other tip, and this may not be for everybody, but if I'm writing in first person and I'm looking for the funny, I will literally get up in my office and tell the story to my empty office as if I'm doing a stand-up routine. Not that that's what's going to go on the page, but just to remind myself, like, I am trying to tell a funny story. So how would I do that to my audience?
Mm-hmm. Good tip. Good tip. I think pets are also good for that. Tell the story to your dog. And
That's right. Great audience.
let's see here. A couple people have asked about. You talked about how you don't go back in time, and that was um, in reference to the Stranded series, but also with your middle school series. It's always moving forward, right? So you're not working backstory into the novels.
I don't think I've ever done flashback. I've done prologues that go to flashbacks and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a really great reason, that's fine, I would say.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But in most cases, it's I think authors tend to use flashbacks more than they need to. A lot of authors, they love the idea of I can do the backstory this way, and a lot of times we don't need it. The readers just want to know from here going forward what's happening.
I think we don't give necessarily enough weight to the fact that a lot of middle grade readers really just want to know what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that we take that question seriously enough, or put it as front and center as we always should.
Yeah. Well, and even the prologue, I know when I was reading YA, when I was of that age and middle grade, there were a lot more prologues back then. We have far fewer now. When is it a good time to use a prologue? What would be a good reason for using a prologue, in your opinion?
If I don't have a good idea for a hook at the start of if my actual beginning of my story is quiet in some way, it's a great way to sort of infuse some action and energy, and to create a question: how the heck is this character going to end up in the Viking series? We started with he was back in time, he was in a battle, and
Mm-hmm.
basically said, how did I get here? And then we went back and explained. You can argue about, a lot of kids will skip prologues, they don't like prefaces. But it can be a good way to jumpstart the book if you don't have a great chapter one in that regard. And especially these days in very competitive markets, when editors are going to want to be grabbed, maybe to an unfair degree, by your first pages. Sometimes, that might speak to the creation of a real grabber of a prologue. I
Mm-hmm.
think quiet prologues are even more problematic.
I agree. Yeah. And I've seen prologues probably more often in genre fiction, like in a mystery. You might get a little glimpse into the crime in the prologue.
Yeah.
And then chapter one, we start with the protagonist who has yet to even know about the crime that took place. So I think it can be used for good purpose, like you said, to kind of hook the reader early on. But as just a way to sneak in backstory, I think is not a good reason.
Yeah, I always recommend people keep a parking lot somewhere of the people. Another thing people try to do is cram way too much information into their chapter one, and really be disciplined with yourself about not what do you want to tell, but what does the reader absolutely need to know right now. And then don't throw away the other stuff. Put it in a document somewhere and just continually consult with it. And over time, I guarantee you'll be like, oh, in the bakery scene, he could say that. And later at home, he can do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, here's a great. We're wrapping up here, but I got a a tough one for you.
Uh-oh.
What is the average length of middle grade novels? And here's the hard part. How many drafts and how long should it take to write, say, a 55,000 word manuscript?
I am working on a 55,000 word contracted manuscript right now. It's funny that that number should pop up. I've been given 6 months to write that manuscript. My drafts, I would say my average number of drafts is about 12. The stranded books were 25,000 words each with cliffhangers. So really it was one book of about 75,000 words over the course of 3 books. The middle school books are 30 to average about 40,000 words.
So 6 months, do you write full time? Do you write every day for a certain amount of time?
I do work every day, some days more successfully than others. I'm not one for the goals that a lot of writers give themselves. I don't do word counts or page counts or anything like that. If I am really pushing myself, I'll do a time thing. I'm going to work till 9 o'clock tonight or whatever it might be. And not everybody has to work every day, but I find that to be an invaluable habit.
Okay. And then 12 drafts. And remember, people, he's got a lot of experience at this. So if it takes you 20 drafts, don't feel like you're doing it wrong. It probably took you a lot of practice to get to the point where you could do it in 12 drafts.
It really depends on the book. I mean, one of the dirty little secrets is that you get better, but it never gets easier. You want to keep, doing better.
Sure. Yeah. You keep raising the bar for yourself, which is a good thing. Yeah. Okay, well, I know we could be here all night answering questions. You've got so much to share with us, but I want to respect your time. So thank you, Chris. And what I am going to ask you a favor. I've had a lot of people still asking in the chat box about the books you mentioned, the bloggers, etc. If you can write those out for me in an email, and we will put the links to those under the replay when we send it out tomorrow. So if you are watching the replay, they're right under your video. That would be very helpful. I appreciate that.
Sure thing.
So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It was super fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. I love CBI alumni showing up and chatting. That's great. So thank you all, and we will see you all next week. All right. Good night.